Thanks for coming on the Radical Fabulatorium, Trevor, Mr. Trevor Murray. Appreciate your time.
Anytime.
Perfect. We maybe just for full disclosure, I should say that I've known Trevor since what, grade 2?
Grade 1.
Grade 1.
Grade 1.
So we're going deep cuts, deep into the past.
Yeah.
So I could drag those up, put you on the spot, even though I know, I can pull out some dirty laundry.
Yeah, there's not much of that. No one has embarrassing moments through teenage years. And
Yeah, we're clean cut.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, yeah, so I brought you on the show, Trevor, because I thought it'd be interesting to talk about building code stuff. Yeah. So you've had a couple roles in the industry. I know you started out at the town of Quispam-Sis. What was your actual title there?
So when I started there, I was the assistant building inspector.
Okay.
After about 6 years, I moved on to be the chief building official and bylaw enforcement officer there.
Okay. After about 6 years of being the assistant?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And the issue there was, myself and there was another inspector there. We were both technically assistants, but there was no building official. There was no chief building official there. So we used to joke that we were assistants to no one. We did obviously have people on the organization chart who were higher than us, but there was no next person in line. That position remained unfilled until I filled it.
Okay. But did they like put that position together for you, or basically they just they asked you to step up, or did you have to apply? Like what?
There was no application. Basically, what happened was there was a pretty serious job offer that came my way. Yeah. And the only way for the town to keep me was to give me that next step up.
Okay.
The town felt I was ready anyway. It was just that kind of logical progression. Mm-hmm. And kind of the catalyst to it, I'd say, was getting that offer.
Okay. So without that offer, you may have found yourself going in a different direction.
Potentially. I mean, over the years, I started to get more and more offers. So there's no shortage, and there still is no shortage of work in this industry. So there's plenty of opportunity. But yeah, absolutely. You can go in a bunch of different ways once you get in.
Okay. Yeah, and you mentioned off air before we hit record that like in that gig was more on the ground, like in the field, I guess, so to speak.
Yeah. Verifying
the codes. Whereas now you're more into policy, which we can talk about after, but maybe you can describe a little bit what it's like to be in the field as a building inspector.
Yeah. So building inspection, and I'll nitpick terminology a little bit.
Yeah, do it.
So a building inspector is somebody who inspects buildings.
Okay.
Then we also have plan reviewers, and they review plans. And then we have building officials, and building officials do both. So they do inspections and plan review. And in the province of New Brunswick, it's pretty much universal that everybody's a building official. Everybody's reviewing plans and they're doing inspections. But that's generally the delineation. Okay. So a large portion of my day was spent doing site inspections. Another large portion was doing plan review, and then of course there's administration, bylaw enforcement, and general management duties. Inspection specifically, the way it works in the town of Quispam-Sis and most municipalities, including RSCs in the province, they have what are called mandatory inspections. So that is like you have specific critical points in the construction where everything stops, a building official shows up, they conduct an inspection, make sure everything's good to continue to the next phase. Okay. So that is kind of the way those are set up. That works. We always said this is a balance between the public's interests of having a safe building, and for people who are owning the building, having a good investment. Mm-hmm. And also it benefits our contractors because they get kind of some insurance, for lack of a better term, of saying, yes, our building is built properly. Have been to court a couple of times, and I've always been called on behalf of the defense, being a builder who was getting sued by a certain owner saying, you didn't do something right. And I was more than happy to show up and say, well, actually, the builder went through all the proper, procedures. They passed their inspections. We didn't note any deficiencies. Mm-hmm. And luckily, our builders were very successful in defending those lawsuits with my testimony.
Okay, interesting. So the moments that a building official has to show up to inspect, is that like at the same point on every project, or is that something the contractor lays out? Like, I need you to come out at this moment, or like, how's that?
It's organized? Generally dictated by the building inspector. There is kind of some movement in that space around risk-based inspections. So the way it's set up in a lot of places now, they just say, we need you to show up at this time, this time, and this time. But it really doesn't differentiate like, let's say, a detached garage from like a hospital.
Okay.
And that doesn't make any sense because obviously a hospital is way more dangerous, way more concerning for life safety than a detached garage. So there's some movement in this for the risk-based inspections to look at hospitals a little bit differently. As I was kind of headed out the door with the town of Quispam-Sis, we were starting to look at that. And now with my new role with the province, we're looking with that with our Building Code Administration Act as to how we can incorporate that into legislation that is logical and easy to understand and works for everybody.
Okay, works for everybody, the whole province.
Yeah.
So when you were at the town of Quispam, was there already like a provincial framework you were referencing, or is it kind of like the municipalities got to make some of the decisions and guidelines? Or
there's a little bit of both, and it's changed. So the way it used to work is the authority to create a building bylaw was under the Community Planning Act. And that was kind of it was almost like a do whatever you want section of the Community Planning Act. It wasn't well established. It wasn't well defined.
Okay.
The province had tried a couple of times to go in and really get their hands dirty to provide more legislation, more guidance around there. But nothing really made it off the ground until February of 2021 when we got the Building Code Administration Act into place.
Okay.
But it basically created the authority for local jurisdictions, local governments to create a building bylaw, which allows them to create a scheme of permits, fees, and to kind of dictate inspections. On the other side, in unamalgamated regions or areas without a building bylaw, we had a regulation that kind of was enforceable by regional service commissions and their employees who are building inspectors there.
Okay. So is it fair to say it was like a little disjointed beforehand, but now it's becoming more not centralized, but like
we call it harmonized.
Harmonized.
That's the friendly word.
Okay.
Yeah, it was. So basically, municipalities could even pick which codes and what parts of the code. So the way we always put it, it kind of didn't make sense if you're from New Brunswick and you look at some of like the city of St. John, and then right beside it you have Rossay, and right beside that you have Quispam-Sis, and you can drive between those communities not knowing you're changing communities. But all of a sudden, different building codes might come into effect based on which side of that imaginary line you're on. That's a huge issue for design professionals like engineers, architects. Huge issue for contractors working in that space to try to figure out, well, am I on this side of the imaginary line or that side? It's really lost productivity.
Interesting. So like you could be living in St. John. I could hire someone from Sussex to come build a home. But now all of a sudden, maybe they've only ever built in Sussex at this point, and they have to think about managing the codes. Like, they might. Okay.
And so that was kind of the driving factor for the province actually getting this new Building Code Administration Act off the ground.
Okay. Do you know if is this a common thing across the country, or do most provinces have this building code?
Most provinces adopt a province-wide code. There are The notable exception is the city of Vancouver. They are a charter city, so they have their own building code, and obviously they're large enough that they can make that work.
Okay, yeah.
Pretty much every other province, every other community, they adopt a province-wide code.
Province-wide code. Okay. So what does it look? Still thinking about being in the field. What does it look like when you go out to do an inspection? Let's say, I don't even know really how to say it, but like, let's say a contractor's half done a job, if that's even a way to describe it. Like, what does that process look like?
Yeah, so if they've hit one of those points where framing inspection is probably the one that everybody has in their mind. Like there's a house, it's got all the lumber framed up in it. Basically, you're going out, you're walking through that building, looking for the completeness of the structure, making sure all the structural elements are there, trusses are, proper orientation, have the right bearing. There's no damage to them. Wall systems are in place. The layout's kind of what you were looking at. It might not be 100%, but it's close enough because site constraints, if you have floor joists in certain places, you might need to move a wall a little bit to run plumbing by something or HVAC around a floor joist or a beam. Supportive beams, supportive girder trusses. There's a whole list of things that you get into when you're looking at that. Just making sure stuff that gets buried is okay, basically, at that stage.
Okay. And this is referencing, like, they would have submitted a plan or like a layout or a blueprint to get the permit to build in the beginning stages anyway?
Yeah, typically, and it's without, I think, any exception now in the province, you need to submit like a reasonably detailed plans to build your building, whether it's a house or a commercial occupancy. And that has to, it goes a little bit deeper than that. There's specifications involved in a lot of cases too, to make sure the energy code is met. But yeah, it's very, a lot of this in the field is verifying, one, that they're meeting kind of what they've submitted as their documents, and two, that the things that because there's things that doesn't make sense to detail on there. It doesn't make sense to detail how you're running all your plumbing in a house.
Okay.
It's cost prohibitive, and generally you can't detail it in enough detail for it to actually work on site.
Okay.
You'll see that on some commercial occupancies because it's bigger and it's a little bit easier to spend money on those professionals. So a lot of stuff when you're dealing with the smaller projects is you're checking them on site. And that gets even worse when you're dealing with, small additions like small rooms that are added onto buildings or minor renovations, because you're dealing with like a $25,000 project. You can't go out and say, I need you to do $10,000 to $15,000 worth of plans.
Yeah.
You've got to check a lot more in the field. So it is kind of a sliding scale as to the requirements.
Okay.
But yeah, you do check, and there are things that have to change in the field no matter what. The saying, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. In this case, the enemy is the construction process.
Okay.
So the plans get changed. You've got a homeowner standing there and say, oh, actually, instead of my window here, I want it moved over here.
Yeah.
And then we got to look at that and figure out, is there any impacts? Does that create a loading issue?
Okay.
Or is this just moving a window from one spot in a load-bearing wall to another spot in the load-bearing wall, and everything kind of stays the same?
Okay. Interesting. So, and as a building inspector, so you mentioned like the framing in or checking the structural stuff. Do you also have to, is it your responsibility to check the electrical and the plumbing as well?
No, the province. So say most of it is the province. Province is 100%. They do all the electrical in the province. Plumbing, they do most of it, with exception of the only municipalities coming to mind would be Moncton and St. John. They have their own plumbing inspectors on staff.
Okay. That's their specialty, so to speak.
Yeah. And generally your plumbing inspectors are licensed plumbers.
Okay.
They are people who've done plumbing, they've taken the courses, and they know what they're talking about. When it comes to building inspection, we look at the impact that the plumbing has on the building itself. So like the holes they cut through things, reductions in insulation, how the plumbing penetrates through the building envelope to make sure there's not ingress of water or air or anything like that, to keep the outside out and the inside in type of deal.
Okay. So in theory, you could show up at a job and a plumber has mistakenly cut through
a structural beam,
weight bearing or load bearing,
which happens.
That happens. Okay.
And then somebody's got to correct it.
Okay.
Typically not the plumber.
So those are those moments where you might run into. So that would be like you're delivering bad news, and I would imagine it's going to lead to an uncomfortable conversation between between two parties.
Yeah, and the joke in building inspection is always that your job is basically to ruin people's days.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because even one of my former town managers, I would always have issues with the way certain people approached management. And she would always remind me, she goes, yeah, but Trevor, you have hard conversations for a living. This is what you do, is you talk to people and you get this, you have to get them working towards an actual solution. And I would always argue back. I'm like, well, they're a manager. That's their job too, to work with their employees to actually have the hard conversations. Anyway, I never won that argument with the town manager, but still believe that to this day. But yeah, a lot of times you're dealing with someone who, and to be fair to builders, you know, we generally have two camps. People who are really driven by quality. They really need to produce a good quality building, and finances take a little bit of a back seat. And then there's the other side who they're a little bit more financially driven, and they can let quality slip a little bit, which is fine. Everybody's got to pay their mortgage and keep their family fed. I don't judge anybody for how they approach it, but it certainly changes how you approach that conversation as a regulator.
Okay.
If you can talk about it with their value structure in mind, then you face a lot less impediment to getting them to address what the issue is.
Okay. So if you know you're going to have a conversation with someone who is not worried about money but is going for quality, you approach it one way. And then if you know the other person's financially constrained, you kind of tackle it from another. And I can give some examples with that. Dealing with somebody who was really focused on quality one day, walked in and there is a large point load. So when I talk about point load, it means it has collected a bunch of structural loading from around a building and concentrated in one area. And that needs carried right down to the foundation. And they had their framer, it wasn't the contractor, the general contractor. They had a subcontractor who framed it. And it was kind of a mess the way they assembled it. They had blocks going every which way. And I talked to him and I said, you know, that looks like a mess. And, you know, by code is supposed to be straight up and down. And he said, well, Trevor, you and I both know nothing will ever go wrong there. And I said, well, maybe nothing will ever go wrong. But in 30 years, if anybody opens up that wall and sees that, that's what they're going to think of your quality. And he says, well, I'm not fixing it. And I said, okay. And then I walked away. And then I came back to check on something else a couple of days later. And it had been fixed because I worked within his value structure to identify the issue. On the other side, when you're dealing with people who are a little bit more financially driven, you talk about risk avoidance and liability avoidance. So when we talk about that, we say, you know, the concern here is that you're going to have callbacks. You're going to have customers who are saying, hey, my house is drafty. This floor squeaks. This, this door doesn't close quite right. And that's really expensive for builders. Builders want nothing else than when they hand you the keys to your brand new home, that they never hear from you again. You know, they want their money and they like to move on. The only thing they want to hear is how much you love your new house. Yeah, gotcha.
If they have to show back up and they have to redeploy their crews, they have to bring out all their tools, that gets really expensive really fast. So when you start talking about it in that way and not even getting into potential legal liabilities, but just like, hey, going back and fixing things, that really resonated with them and saying, okay, well, yeah, I can definitely see why this is necessary to prevent a potential harm later on.
Okay. Yeah, that's really interesting. And of course, that would mess up the builder's schedule if they have to come back and fix
100%. Now, well, and the reality is now they're taking a person off a paying job and putting them on a job that they've already been paid for.
Yes.
So that kind of messes with their perception of income.
Okay.
They almost feel like they're doing something for free sometimes.
Yeah.
So if you can kind of frame it as like, do it while they're here. And builders understand what costs them money. They know. So if you start hitting on those things as a building inspector, going like, hey, this is going to cost you more money. They respond to it.
Absolutely. Okay. That makes perfect sense. Yeah. If you're telling someone that, you know, you're gonna have to send a guy for half day labor, basically out of your pocket, I think that's kind of explains itself if that's your main concern.
Exactly.
You mentioned the one you were talking about, the example of quality, the person making the change. You mentioned the issue to him and walked away from it. Like, for some reason, my intuition is like you'd want to convince the person in the moment and have the situation dealt with right there in the spot. But then as you were talking, it makes me wonder, how often do you kind of like lob that idea out there and walk away, and then the other person stews on it, and then they end up making the quote unquote right decision?
Well, and the issue there kind of is, that's a builder I'd worked with for 7 to 8 years at that point. I knew that when I walked away from that, it was getting done. I didn't need to convince him. He needed to convince himself.
Okay.
And this is one of these builders who, you know, very quality driven, but always be like, Trevor, you're taking money off of, you know, out of my grandchildren's pocket. He was an older gentleman, and he was kind of, you know, his kids were now helping run the organization. But, you know, I knew when I said that this is going to be a quality issue and this is your name on this, it's not just his name, it's his kids' names on it. So it was a legacy thing for him.
Okay.
So if you understand who you're working with, it gives you a little bit of freedom to work with them.
Okay.
And I didn't realize how much I changed how I spoke to people until I hired a building official. The last 3 years I was working for the town. And one day she figured out she could tell who I was talking to on the phone based on how I was talking.
Okay. Interesting.
She's
like down to the person, like down to the contractor?
Yeah,
Okay.
knew which contractor I was talking to based on how I was speaking to them.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah.
So you developed that skill like accidentally, sort of. Yeah.
Well, and it's, I always call myself a scientist more than anything. And it basically, you're just doing trial and error. And once you come to a point where you're like, okay, this skill works, I've refined the skill enough that it's working. You know, that's kind of your blueprint for success.
Okay.
And it works with everything in that space of like social interactions, enforcement, reviewing plans, and issuing permits. So it's really something that I found I benefited from when I started looking back. And I had the benefit when I was working with the town having a couple really, really good mentors.
Okay.
And it's interesting to me because I was always really on the more mathematical engineering side, but these mentors came from like human resources, like what we call soft skills backgrounds.
Okay.
And once I started leaning more into that, I started understanding what I was doing and why it was so successful.
Okay. Interesting. I remember you'd mentioned something to me in the past about how when you were dealing with an issue with, I think you were using it like as a town resident, as an example, like whatever their problem is the most important problem to them in that moment. And I'd like to hear you talk about that a little bit. But before that, I was wondering, just thinking again about dealing with the contractors, the quality versus the ones who are financially paying more attention to the finances. Could you tell, like, did you see a lot of turnover in companies who would form for a few years and then go under? And then could you tell whether like a new company was going to succeed or do you know what I mean? Like, could you feel that?
Basically, anybody at either ends of those spectrums, like they're only concerned about quality or they're only concerned about finances, they're not long for this world.
Okay.
You need both.
Okay.
And it's like anything in the world, like we like to think in terms of like binary answers where it's either this or that, but the answer is you need to be both at a certain level. It's just which side of it you're kind of leaning on.
Okay.
So I'd say anybody who was within like far to the extremes, they were in trouble. And you could tell there were people who like, it wouldn't matter what the cost was. They need to make sure that baseboard on that wall is perfect.
Okay.
And you're like, well, at a certain point, your customer no longer cares how much more perfect this baseboard is. You know, you've hit that level of diminishing returns. And 100%, these were gorgeous houses. But that builder would never get their investment back. And the same on the other side, the builder just doing stuff for the cheapest possible way. Customers see that.
Okay.
They're like this home, especially in home building. I always laugh when people talk about like, oh, well, I got a commercial contractor. Commercial contractors, you know, I always, you know, if you're sitting in an office and you get a draft and you go talk to facilities management, they're like, oh, well, here's a space heater. Here, bring a blanket in, wear a sweater. If you have a draft in your home, they chase that sucker down. They find it and they eliminate it.
Okay.
So I always kind of laugh at that approach of like thinking commercial contractors are somehow superior to residential ones.
Okay.
When generally residential ones are held to the little bit higher standard in that regard. And I'm not trying to bash commercial contractors because they have their scope of work is way bigger than residential ones typically are, but it's just different tools. And people think there's like a superiority to one. It's like, no, it's like this tool is for this application and this tool is for a different application.
No, I get that actually. I think I would have probably been in the camp of like assuming a commercial builder is whatever. I don't know. has more skills, I would say, even though that's the appropriate, not the appropriate way to say it. But then it makes me think like it'd be like asking someone who works on heavy equipment for a living to come fix your car. It's not, maybe they're working on bigger equipment and bigger engines, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to know how to fix your gasoline engine.
Yeah, exactly. You know? They have a different skill set.
They have a different skill set. Okay. That's interesting. So maybe if you don't mind talking about what I mentioned there earlier about because it's interesting how you kind of develop those soft social skills through mentors and just kind of like you added that to your kind of mathematical brain.
Yeah.
And like I said, you'd mentioned to me in the past that sometimes dealing with residents who are having an issue, like no matter what the problem is, and no matter how it might seem insignificant to you, the listener, like to that person who's making the complaint, it's the most important problem to them in that moment.
Yeah, and I guess the best illustration of this was during one of the spring freshets, the worst spring freshet the town had ever had. And
maybe you could, what's a freshet?
Freshet basically is a spring flood, basically during the melt of all the winter snow up north, and it all comes south.
Okay.
And that creates we call it a freshet, but it's functionally it's a flood.
Okay. Cool.
So during one of these spring floods, the worst one is we did have a couple people who had pretty severe damage to their homes. One of my side jobs, anybody who works for a small local government will know that when you're given a job, it also comes with about 5 or 6 other kind of peripherally interesting jobs.
Okay.
And one of those things is I did some emergency planning.
Okay.
So at this point, I think I had been working 12 days straight doing like 10 to 14-hour days.
Okay.
And somebody comes into our office and they're upset because their neighbor is cutting down trees to install a pool. Now, when I say the neighbor's cutting down trees, the neighbor is cutting down trees that the neighbor owns. It's on their own property. Mm-hmm. They haven't crossed the property line over and cutting down somebody else's trees. They want to install a pool on their own property.
Okay.
So this woman is in tears, concerned. And so obviously, if you're looking at this, you're like, okay, right now I'm trying to deal with people some of these people are getting severely damaged to like their house is severely damaged, can't be lived in some cases. Mm-hmm. And this woman is upset because the neighbor's cutting down some trees. Mm-hmm. It is challenging, but the mental gymnastics I found that I had to put myself through to not be completely dismissive is understand that if this woman's acting this way, this is the worst problem she has. Mm-hmm. And people don't seem to be able to kind of take a step back and really, I shouldn't say can't. The ones I dealt with this mindset, they didn't have an ability to gain any really outside perspective of how big or small their problems were. Mm-hmm. When they had their biggest problem was the biggest problem. It didn't matter on that continuity of like the best problem in the world versus the worst problem in the world. They didn't see where it fell on that. Okay. So you just kind of had to accept them that the way they felt was the absolute worst problem in the world going on right now. Mm-hmm. And luckily, a lot of the residents there, you could actually talk through on that a little bit. Mm-hmm. and say, well, like, listen, here's the situation. In that case, I heard the woman out and I said, here's some options for you. You could look at covenants. You could look at, but the issue she had was she had cut down all the trees on her own property right to the lot line. Mm-hmm. It also helps trying to understand what the core of the issue was. And hers was loss of privacy, mm-hmm. which she felt would negatively affect the value of a property. Okay. Which I asked her to like really investigate that mm-hmm. to see if that's really going to change the value of her property or if that's mm-hmm. just her own personal view of the value. Yeah. And the way I asked her to do that is just to drive around some subdivisions and see, a lot of these subdivisions don't have trees in the backyard. They don't have a lot of privacy. Mm-hmm. So maybe that's something that adds value to her, but it doesn't necessarily add value to everybody else. Okay. And the other issue was I said, well, if you're in the subdivision, there's covenants in subdivisions sometimes that deal with, maintaining tree buffers and things like that. Not typically in residential, but usually mm-hmm. you have them when you're dealing with one use of land kind of butting up against another one, like you have housing butting up against a commercial use, there's generally buffers there that have to be maintained to minimize the impact of more intensive use on less intensive use. I said, but if you have that, you probably also violated it because you cut down all the trees on your property. So you might want to be very careful venturing into that space.
Okay.
So she kind of recognized that a little bit. But she actually responded really well when I said, I think you need to explore whether this is just your own personal feeling that that there's damage to your value of your property through loss of privacy, or if this is actually a real thing.
Okay.
And she kind of took that to heart. To be fair to her, she was open and heard me, which is always nice. Because there's also people who just will not listen, and it's their opinion, which is the most challenging people to deal with. But there was a moment when I sat there and I said, I'm so sorry, but I can't deal with this any longer because I literally have people whose houses are underwater. Yeah. And I've got to deal with that. And to her credit, she recognized that and said, no, absolutely. And I appreciate the time you're spending with me. So
interesting. So it's a good skill to have, to find that kind of way to approach a problem where to her, it probably ended up feeling like a win-win. Even if she didn't get the answer she wanted, it probably felt like she was heard.
Well, and I think that's what you have to do, that in that space of listening to someone. They have to feel like you actually understand their concerns, because you can't just tell them, no, we can't help you. Yeah. Because if they don't think you understand your concerns, you logically can't be like, no, we can't help you. Yeah. Because you have no idea what the issue is to begin with. Yeah. You didn't even take the time to actually learn what the problem is. Exactly. So if you don't know what the issue is, you don't know whether there's a reasonable solution or not. So that is like number one, you have to do that. Okay. Does a building official or inspector ever have to get in between a contractor and the buyer or the person who's going to live in the home to like solve disputes of any kind? Is that ever something that happens? A lot of what we do is provide code interpretation and guidance in that space. So if a property, it's not usually the owner. It's usually, so even when you're buying a new home, I do recommend a home inspection because building officials only enforce the National Building Code. Okay. Home inspectors, who are privately contracted individuals that you pick out of a phone book or the internet, they work directly for you. And they do some code stuff, but they also do workmanship issues. So that's why I recommend it. Is when I inspect it as a building official, I don't inspect it for workmanship. I have no legislated authority to enforce anything related to workmanship. Okay, that's why a home inspector is so valuable. Okay. Generally, the times we've had to get involved was there was a home inspector who had kind of a faulty code interpretation. The one coming to mind was we had done a final inspection on a new home a couple years back. Then this lady had put it up for sale, and the home inspector came back and said, well, there needs to be a fire separation between the garage and the house. There needs to be what's called a fire code is the general term, but in code it's type X gypsum board. It's a fire rated sheet of gyprock. Okay. The home inspector said there needs to be that on the garage side of the demising wall between the garage and the house. The problem is the code didn't support that. Okay. So the way the code is laid out, we call those storage garages, where you're storing a vehicle, as opposed to a repair garages where you're repairing a vehicle. So kind of a different application there, but a storage garage for a residential home, provided it's not capable of storing more than 5 vehicles, it's generally considered part of the home. So there's no fire separation requirement there. Oh, okay. Interesting. And it's the way it works in the code is kind of slightly convoluted. It says it requires 2 hours, and then if it's attached to a home which it serves, it only requires a 1.5 hour separation. And then if it's no more than 5 vehicles, it's 1.5, and then it's attached to a home which it serves, then the fire separation referred to in sentence 2 need not apply is the exact wording from the code on that. And it's still burned into my brain from talking with this home inspector. Pun intended? Yeah. So we discussed this, and he said, well, need not apply means it does apply. And I said, well, no, it doesn't. And this was a 20-minute discussion on what need not apply does.
Okay.
At the end of it, he says, well, you say it's this and I say it's that. Who makes the final call? And I say, well, I do. I'm the building official the municipal building official. Like, it's my call. You're no offense, but you're just a home inspector.
Yeah.
I'm empowered by provincial legislation.
Okay. Yeah.
So a little bit of a difference. He says, well, that's awfully convenient. And I said, well, it is for me.
Yeah.
Because at this point, I was frustrated.
Yeah.
I say, you can overturn this. You have to file, at the time it was Court of Queen's Bench, now Court of King's Bench. You can sue the town, basically, to overturn it. But, when we got the call from that woman who had received this report, she says, I've got this report and you guys didn't do your jobs. And I said, well, whoa. What exactly didn't we do? She read it and I said, no, it's not required. And she goes, well, how certain are you that it's not required? He's saying it is. And I said, well, ask him for a code section. And I say, I'll tell you what, if he can provide a code section, we'll come and do it for you for free. I said, it's worth that for us to get that education. And I mean, the reality is we're talking about $50 to $100. It's not a huge amount of money, but if somebody can point to the code in an area where not only did we not know, no one in the building and official community, because we meet on a fairly regular basis, there's good consensus in the province on this, that's not a requirement. Sometimes it's a best practice. Some insurance carriers want to see it.
Okay.
But as far as the building code, it's not a code requirement.
Okay. Interesting. So does insurance have any sort of sway on the way codes are changed or anything?
They do on a national level.
Okay.
So they will push for certain things. If insurance carriers are seeing a lot of claims coming from a certain direction, they will provide advice. And there's a whole thing we can talk about a little bit later on. We can talk about the code development system, which is a whole other thing. But yeah, there is a way to do that. On a local level, the real interaction between building officials and insurances comes after fires.
After fires that cause significant damage.
And there's insured losses.
Okay.
There are provisions in most insurances that you bring stuff back. When it's replaced to code.
Okay.
And the question is to what degree. So that's kind of a careful negotiation between building officials and then the insurance carrier to understand exactly what is necessary.
Okay.
And that can change during construction, during that process, because things can be found later on that, this is also damaged. We didn't know about it at the time. So that can be a little bit of a moving target.
Okay. Interesting. And okay. So yeah, I'd like to move on to the provincial side of things, your new role. But before we do, maybe just because I know everyone's always curious about building inspectors, do you have any advice, or have you seen the best of the best inspectors? Is there, for someone who's looking for an inspector, do you have any sort of tips and tricks that someone
for
could
a building inspector or home inspector?
Sorry, home inspector. Yeah. Home inspector. As if you're going to buy a new building or a new house.
It's really challenging because there's not a lot of licensing requirements around that right now in the province. I go with someone who has, if you ask code questions to, they don't have hard and fast answers. The good way to, and I always say this, the good way to understand whether somebody's a professional or not is if you ask a question, if they come back with the answer, it depends, they're a professional.
Okay.
They know what they're doing. If they come back with a hard and fast solution, they might be okay, but they probably don't have an expert knowledge of the building code specifically.
Okay, so someone who's willing to say it depends, or might even say I don't know, understands that there's nuances that you can't just give 100%.
Yeah, and that's what happens a lot. If you ask a building official a question, you're like, hey, I've got this detached garage, but building officials are going to tell you almost every single time, I need to see it, or I need to review the plans, or they're having hard and fast answers in those cases. It becomes so nuanced in certain things that even things people think are quote unquote simple. And it'd be the same with home inspection.
Okay.
Simple things get so nuanced sometimes that anybody who comes out with hard and fast answers for every little thing, I'd say that's a red flag.
Okay. That's good to know, because I know, like, I'm someone who I'm a worrier for sure. So I know when I was like, we were looking at a property and we had someone look at it who did a wicked. Actually, you recommended him, but he did a great home inspection. But even like, even though I felt like he did a really good job, it's still in the back of my mind. I'm just like, the what ifs are frustrating.
It's funny because me working in the job I do, I often wonder how anybody else is able, like how the average person like yourself can buy a house, buy a building in good faith, and be like, I feel good.
I didn't feel good.
No.
I had your advice to lean on. I had this gentleman who did a great job. My realtor was awesome. My wife was like level-headed. I didn't enjoy any of it. None of the process I enjoyed. I didn't like any of it. I was like, this is the word. This is not for me at all. But it was good to go through it. It's a good learning experience.
Yeah. It's always a good learning experience to go through that stuff.
So let's move to the province. So you mentioned in 2021. Let me get this straight here. So you're a building code administrator now for the province?
Yeah.
Okay. So is this a position that was vacant that you filled, or was this a position the province created with the new code structure that came in 2021?
Yeah. So when this came out in 2021, the province created a building code administrator role, and that bounced around a little bit. It was initially done by the person who drafted the Building Code Administration Act.
Okay.
They didn't stay in that role long. Then it bounced over to Mike Lewis, who's my boss. He's the provincial fire marshal.
Okay.
And he kept that for a little bit less than a year, I believe. Did the best job he could, considering he's the executive director of technical inspection services and also the provincial fire marshal. And those are basically two full-time jobs. I have no idea how he does both of them, but he does them and does a pretty good job, I must say. And then he has this on the side. So he quickly found he needed someone to fill that role. So it was May of 2023 that I took on that. I moved into that role.
Okay. So the role had existed for a couple of years, but you were you tasked with like organizing it, or like
Yeah. So basically, building code administrator is kind of a weird title. So most people call me the provincial chief building official.
Okay.
What my role is primarily is to manage the Building Code Administration Act and its regulations.
Okay.
Underneath that, I also hear appeals of orders of local officials. So if you got an order from a building official and you disagree with the order, you can appeal it. So our appeals right now are fairly limited on their scope. It is only for code interpretation. So if you disagree on the technical interpretation of the National Building Code that's being taken by the building official, you can appeal that and you can state your case, and I would review it and issue a decision on that.
Can you give an example?
I'm trying to think of one that's not really technical. We had an appeal. That one's really technical.
Is it usually quite technical? Like it's usually getting into the weeds?
Typically, once there's an appeal of something, it gets really, really technical, really, really fast. A good example would be the fire separation in the garage we just talked about.
Okay.
So if a building official came in and said, no, you have to put that 5/8 type X fire code gypsum on the inside of your garage, the builder says, I don't think I need to, and the local building official issued an order, then that contractor could appeal that to me and say, hey, I don't think this is right. I want this third-party review. It's free. It's fast. Before that, the only review was actually to take that building official to Court of King's Bench.
Oh, okay.
So it was a huge deal. Really costly, very time-intensive. To have that appeal heard by me, it is free. We turn that around in 2 weeks.
Okay.
So free, relatively fast.
Okay. So that I was going to ask about the time, because if you're in the middle of a construction and there's this appeal going on, it obviously would stay the construction, right? Like you'd have to until it's solved.
And it depends, because it depends on what the order states, because there's orders to comply, which basically force you to do a thing.
Okay.
But then there's also a stop work order, which would stop construction. So if it's just an order to comply, work can go on around that as long as it doesn't impact that thing.
Okay.
And I always kind of advise our building officials to be very, very cognizant of what order they're issuing, because if something doesn't rise to the level of a stop work order, then they shouldn't be issuing a stop work order.
Oh, I see. So a contractor in, let's just say Miramichi, could be dealing with a building official in that area, and they might issue a stop work order, and then the contractor could appeal it to you
Exactly.
in Fredericton.
Yeah.
And then you could say you'd agree yay or nay, or you could say like, actually, it's not enough to call it a stop work order. It's just like the workaround order that you mentioned.
Well, and we've never really gone back and said you issued the wrong order.
Okay.
It's just around code interpretation. So we will either reaffirm the building official's order, the local order, modify it, or strike it. Currently, we haven't had one where we actually struck a building official's order in this province.
Okay.
They've all been reaffirmed. We've had engineers and architects appeal things from building officials, and unfortunately, it just their arguments were a little bit lacking.
Okay.
Not to diminish those professionals in those spaces, but there was some issue on their supporting documents.
Okay. So that's probably a good sign though, right? Because that means the building officials are on top of things, doing their job.
Absolutely.
And are the codes ever changing? Like, are the building officials always having to re-up their knowledge?
Yeah. So codes, when we talk about codes, and we can talk a little bit more on the code development side now. Codes are, for the most part, developed by Codes Canada.
Okay.
They develop the building code, the fire code, the plumbing code, the farm building codes, and the National Energy Code for buildings.
Okay.
So there's 5 codes that come out of Codes Canada. That's under the Codes Canada is a branch under the National Research Council. And as my role with the province, I also sit on the board of that to provide input from New Brunswick on issues we're seeing and how we'd like to see the codes change in future.
Okay.
Who work kind of side by side with me, we have our plumbing, our provincial chief plumbing official who provides consultation on the plumbing side. We also have the provincial fire prevention officer, chief fire prevention officer, and he provides consultation on any type of fire code stuff. So it's not just me, I've got some other people feeding into me.
Okay.
And additionally, we do have the engineering, architects, interior designer societies, the New Brunswick Building Officials Association, contractor groups, home builder groups, as well, able to bring stuff to me to deal with, say, this needs to be dealt with, not just on a provincial level, but potentially on a national level as well.
Okay. And that's all under Codes Canada.
Yeah.
Is it like are there decisions like blanket across the country, or do they modify it based on
So this has actually changed a little bit in recent years. The way it was previous to would be October 2022, there was what's called the Canadian Commission on Building and Fire Codes,
Okay.
the CCBFC. And the way that was structured was a little bit different than what we have today. So that started in 1995, ran for about 30 years. So we had provincial and territorial reps that sat at a policy level, and they would say, hey, our province is seeing issues. Then they give it over to the CCBFC, and that would be a group of industry experts, some building officials, some manufacturers representatives, engineers, architects, lots of different interest groups in that space, and they would kind of oversee the development. The challenge with that was sometimes the way it was developed differed from how the provinces wanted to see it developed.
Okay.
So when that happened, the province would just say, well, that's not what I wanted. We're not going to adopt that change. We're going to create our own change. Okay. And that deharmonized the building code system. And we see that today with Ontario, Alberta, BC, and Quebec having pretty major adaptations or versions of their own versions of the national building codes. That was identified as a huge issue to kind of manufacturers,
okay,
and being able to access markets. For example, right now, a ventilation unit in a house, a manufacturer has to make 4 different versions of the same ventilation unit. One that's acceptable generally nationally, one for BC, one for Ontario, and one for Quebec. And that is insane because the climates, the uses are not that different between all of our provinces. You can make an argument that northern Canada and southern Canada are fairly different, but not when you start looking at like Ontario versus BC versus Quebec versus the rest of Canada.
Yeah.
So that issue kind of started what's called a regulatory reconciliation and cooperation table.
Okay.
Where all the provinces and the federal government get together and they all come to an agreement that they're going to move forward on reconciling all the regulations to try to harmonize.
Okay.
And the way they did that is they looked at the code development system and said, what is broken about this? And they said, well, this commission has a lot of really knowledgeable people on it, but they aren't the actual decision makers when it comes to code adoption. We want to keep that knowledge base. So what they did is they moved that over into what's called now the advisory council.
Okay.
They took the people who are the technical decision makers from the policy that was the policy thing. They brought them down into what's now called the Canadian Board for Harmonized Construction Codes, or CBHCC, and then they put political leaders and senior civil servants up on top of them, providing policy direction. The Canadian Table for Harmonized Construction Codes policy.
Okay.
It took me months to learn all of these different names for boards. And anyway, we just call the policy table now, and the codes board is the codes board, just to simplify things. So what that did is it put provinces and territories more directly in the driver's seat on code development, gave us more of a voice in harmonization, because there are things that Ontario has developed or BC has developed or Alberta or Quebec have developed that we want to see brought into the national code. There was stuff when I was on the municipal side where I would just use stuff out of the Ontario side because it benefited my contractors and my builder and my homeowners. Rather than kicking them over to get an engineer, Ontario has a solution that already works for this. That's a prescriptive solution that you just follow that recipe and you get a safe building. Okay. So there's some huge advantages to this as we move towards more harmonization and we eliminate some of the barriers to this border being between provinces trade, and that also that issue exists, that roadblock exists for contractor mobility, for design professionals being architects and engineers and interior designers, and building officials. It creates barriers for them moving from one province to the next. So eliminating that seemed like a good thing basically for everybody.
Yeah. Yeah, and like what you originally said about the ventilate, like using the example of someone who's manufacturing a ventilation system, if they have to modify it for different provinces, and I mean, a large amount of the population's in Ontario, so you would think like maybe a company would just be like, you know what, we're just going to focus on Ontario, and we're not going to ship any of our units or whatever to the East Coast.
Exactly. And so that's this movement towards harmonization actually gives us a lot more competitive environment that should in the end actually reduce construction prices to a limited degree. Okay. I'm not expecting miracles, but
yeah. But at least maybe moving in the right direction.
Yeah, so exactly. Okay. And it also eliminates lost spending, like resources spent on stuff that doesn't provide an actual improvement to the building. An engineer in Ontario has to familiarize themselves with the differences in the codes for New Brunswick. That doesn't help anybody.
Especially because, I mean, they're spending time learning about codes in a significantly smaller market.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's interesting. How many times does an issue have to arise before it becomes considered like, okay, we need a code to fix this, or we need to address this?
Yeah, it's not a hard and fast number. Or I'd go back to gravity of harm and likelihood of harm, or to the two general things. It's how badly could someone be hurt and how often could someone be hurt.
Okay.
And that kind of will elevate or lower it based on the outcome and based on what else is in the hopper. The reality is there are at this point well over 1,000 code change requests in the code system. Code is updated every 5 years. Sometimes they will produce addendums or things that will update stuff depending on what they've got going on. Sometimes there's interpretation issues or stuff was worded incorrectly and they need to correct that. But generally, it's every 5 years they produce a new version of the codes. So we've got to be very strategic with what we're working on and what we're not working on. And we just nailed down the strategies. Actually, we have the 2025 coming out the end of 2025.
Okay.
And we're working on the strategic. We just finalized the strategic priorities of the 2030 code in January of this year.
Okay. So looking ahead, big time.
Yeah.
So you said you have about 1,000 code change requests. Is that typical for the 5-year span, or like? Would you and would they all be touched upon in the updated codes, or it's just like
absolutely not?
No, okay.
There is stuff that's been there for a decade or two at this point where it's not rising to the level where it's actually able to get addressed. It's not a good answer because some of these things, even though they're not major issues, they would help improve the built environment for some people. They would make things a little bit easier, a little bit more budget friendly, but it's not causing a major issue. Then it doesn't get to the top of that list, unfortunately.
Okay. It seems like it'd be difficult to, like, you're balancing safety, making sure you're not implementing codes that are cost prohibitive to contractors. It seems like this delicate balance, really.
It is, and it goes back to policy. So it's how safe is safe enough. And the reality is, if we have a tragic incident where somebody loses their life, cost goes off the table for that person's family. It didn't matter how much it costs.
Yeah.
So that goes back a lot to that political leader / senior civil servant to be able, like, well, we want to go this far and we can't go any further than that.
Okay.
And the reality is, a lot of that is limited by the code system's capacity too, of how much work can they actually do in these cycles.
Okay.
So we can't build a building where there is no chance of harm. That's not a possibility. It's just, so the code always talks about reduction in harm.
Okay.
To that end.
Okay. That makes sense. Do codes ever like sunset or expire or like get removed?
Codes are no longer, so I need to differentiate codes and standards.
Okay.
Codes are when and kind of how. Standards deal with more of the how side of things.
Okay.
So when we talk about and say a building needs to have a sprinkler system, the code just says the building needs to have a sprinkler system. It might detail one or two things about the sprinkler system, but it just says sprinkler system and design it and it needs installed to this standard. And the standard is NFPA 13.
Okay.
The sprinkler standard. And that is another full multiple 100-page document on how to properly design and install a sprinkler system. Standards do expire.
Okay.
They can get withdrawn, which means they're no longer being used actively in the industry. And we see that mostly with manufactured goods. So there are standards on how to make a nail, glass, how to make glass, how to make certain types of engineered wood products. Those will get withdrawn if there's no need for that nail anymore. Those types of things will get withdrawn. Code, on the other hand, it never really gets withdrawn.
Okay.
The code is the code, and it is what it is for off on till the future.
Okay. Is that because maybe something that falls out of practice can come back again, and then you'd want those codes in places?
Well, and the reality is those codes just cease to have effect once the province adopts new codes. Province or territories or indigenous communities would also be another adopting agency.
Oh, okay. Okay, interesting. So they would, and does that happen every 5 years as well?
It depends. Some jurisdictions have an auto-adopt clause, like they automatically adopt the code. Saskatchewan, they automatically adopt the code.
Okay.
Most other ones, they adopt it based on consultation, which is what we're doing right now. We're looking at adoption with the 2020 code, which we're hoping to finalize consultation on this summer.
Okay. Interesting. That's pretty fascinating. So, okay. Because, I mean, it's probably like Do you get a lot of like, for some reason I just feel like because it's a government agency and there's like it's a bureaucratic thing that most of the interactions with people about codes is negative. But do you get like a sense of appreciation from a lot of folks?
Yes. Yeah, I think it's more positive than I'd say negative.
Okay.
Realistically, I saw it more on the building official side than I when I was working as a municipal level than I see it now on the provincial side, because now I'm working more on the policy side of it. And on the policy side, I'd say everybody already understands the benefits of codes. They know we need codes. When I was dealing with the public, there's always a small percentage of like people who they want to do whatever they want to do. And, the government and laws, it doesn't matter to them. They just want to do what they want to do. And that's fine. That is their choice. And I strongly believe in everybody's right to make a decision. And I always endeavored to make sure that was an informed decision of what consequences their decision might have. But I think by and large, it was generally a positive discussion about codes. People saw the value in it. People saw the need for codes in an organized and fair society. So realistically, and I can go back to, when I was working on the municipal side, I had hired a new building inspector and she had been there for about 3 months. And she took me aside one day and she goes, no one yells at you. I'm like, no, why would they yell at me? I'm just doing a job. And she's like, but I thought people would yell at you more. And I said, well, first off, no, I don't yell at anybody, so they don't get to yell at me. That's the deal.
Okay.
But otherwise, I didn't see myself as, using the code as a weapon to like against people. It was a tool to help people.
Okay.
Which is kind of a nuance. The differences are kind of nuanced, but when you're in that industry, it makes sense. And if you talk to most contractors, they can point to people who've tried to use the code against them as a weapon and people who use it to work with them to make sure they have a good building for their customers. And I think on the builder side, a lot of them started to see us as almost like a quality assurance program for them.
Okay.
To make sure that the buildings they were building were actually up to standard and, a good product for their customers.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think it probably is a valid concern that people would worry that someone, of course, in a position of authority of some kind would potentially start to abuse the power. So I could see where that would warp or they would tell themselves stories that must be what is going to happen.
Yeah, and I mean, there is no industry that's immune from that. It happens, unfortunately, in every industry. That's why we felt an appeal system needed to be implemented with this to make sure there was somebody who was able to hold at least people to at least some type of accountability.
Gotcha. Yes. Okay. So if someone is concerned that the local building official is exercising too much power, let's say, they can appeal that decision. And have a third party, non-biased,
completely third party,
emotionally
unbiased
removed
review.
Yeah.
And even in areas we've provided some, we call it non-binding interpretive guidance. So it doesn't bind anybody to act, but we're trying to help the two parties navigate the dispute and come to a resolution so they can move forward. And it's about like interpretation of the Building Code Administration Act or the provincial regulations.
Okay.
So we try to help people kind of say, oh, this is why this is in place. This is the objective of that particular clause within the act. Whether it makes sense in this context or not, leave that up to you guys to discuss. But this is what we were trying to get at as a province to help.
Cool. And if working with the other provincial, do the other provinces have like business building code administrators? Like, is that you'd be interacting with those? It's
pretty much universal between all the other provinces and territories that you have someone, directors, executive directors. Our titles are all slightly different.
Okay.
There's no real consensus on what we should be called, but it's all across Canada. Currently, we're short a couple from the territories. Okay. But apart from that, it's pretty consistent. We have really good representation across Canada.
Okay. If there's any keen listeners out there, any regular old citizens who wanted to like dive into this world or just feel like they were involved in the building code world, is there something they can do or somewhere they can go to
Absolutely.
participate?
I'm so happy you asked. So the Canadian Board for Harmonized Construction Code website, it has a whole page on getting involved. So getting involved, they want contractors, they want engineers, they want architects to sit on these committees that are helping develop the code.
Okay.
Also want building officials. They want well-rounded committees that can look at things at a multiple perspective, interdisciplinary look at these things to make sure that they're not overly skewed in one direction or the other.
Okay.
If you are not in that group, you are still able to participate as an observer. You can show up to almost all the meetings that any of these subcommittees are doing. And the other thing you can do is there's a public reviews. One of them just ended yesterday. But they have them periodically through the year. And what they're doing is they're releasing an advanced look at new code sections.
Okay.
They're telling you what they're trying to do with that change and what that change is going to look like. And we want building officials, engineers, architects, the general public to look at this and say, hey, this makes sense or this doesn't make sense or this could actually be abused based on your current language. Love those types of comments.
Okay.
And the other way people can get involved, if they see an issue with the code, they can submit a code change request directly to the Codes Canada on that same website. So they can say, "Hey, I think the code should really be looking at this new solution or this new way of building." And instead of making someone go through, particularly if you've just recently built a building and you found this is really, I had to go get an engineer for this, and this should really be in the code. It shouldn't be every person going and getting an engineer. Then you can make those cases to the codes board and say, hey, we really should have something in the code that just tells us how to do this instead of forcing everybody to go get an engineer.
Gotcha.
So there's a couple different options there.
Okay. Wow, that's really cool. Yeah, so that's nice to know that people can get involved. And I guess probably a lot of people probably don't know they can get involved or that you would want like...
Yeah, I would be shocked if most people knew they could get involved.
Yeah. Well, it's so important. It affects literally everyone in the country, right? And some level. So
yeah.
Are there any maybe just to wrap it up? Are there any changes coming that you're excited about?
So one of the issues we've always had is doing renovations in buildings and how far the code should or should not apply.
Okay.
What's coming in the 2025 is a whole new thing called alterations to existing buildings. Ontario has some stuff already in their code about this, so we're kind of stealing some of that and putting it into the national code, along with expanding some sections. So the first jump into this is going to be around energy code stuff, about what, you're doing a major renovation on your building. What makes sense to do when?
In terms of like energy efficiency?
In terms of energy efficiency. So, you're gutting a building, you're pulling out all the insulation. Do you put the normal insulation back in, what was there, or do you upgrade the insulation?
Okay.
So provide additional guidance. So right now there's no guidance, which means it's up to the discretion of the local building official. So you can get different answers depending on which community you're in. What you need to do, which is, again, goes back to that harmonization issue.
Okay.
So this is going to provide a lot more guidance. I would stop short of saying it is a full-on solution because there's always nuances, there's always exceptions. The code can't possibly address every single individual situation, but it'll at least get people within a ballpark to get kind of in the same vein of thinking. So that's the first step. The second step we're looking at is potentially within that alterations to existing buildings is dealing with accessibility for people with mobility, cognitive, and sensory impairments. And modifying these buildings, because right now, again, there's no guidance. There are requirements to removing barriers in buildings or ensuring that they don't get designed into buildings. But when particularly we deal with St. John, it's a challenging city because sometimes the front of your building isn't just up against the property line, it's over the property line. So building a ramp isn't an option. There's issues with heritage preservation. So it's about adding amenities to those buildings where it's feasible and logical and common sense without necessarily tearing all the buildings down and rebuilding them from scratch. So that's something we're advocating fairly aggressively on to help provide some level of consistency there, because it is a common complaint from both engineers, architects, I should say, as well as building officials, to find some consistency there between jurisdictions and between projects.
Okay, very interesting. That's something I wouldn't have thought about. Like, just so if you're like ripping out insulation, like you could have lath and plaster, and then in theory, like, even though you would never want to, you could just put that back in, use that again as insulation?
In theory. It depends on the interpretation of the building inspector.
Okay.
And the predominant interpretation or approach is don't make it less safe or don't make it worse. With the understanding that you might look at something as what we refer to in the industry as technically infeasible, as, you know, it's technically infeasible to fit that insulation in that wall because there's no insulation product that will provide that insulation in the wall.
Okay.
So what we do is we look and say, well, you can't hit that, but you can hit this lower amount by using this specific insulation.
Okay.
So that's what we're going to make you do.
Okay.
And they're generally fairly consistent with that, but it's codifying that consistency to make sure you don't have some cowboys off saying, nope, you're going to have to add an inch of foam board to the inside of all your walls now and reduce your sizes, and now you have to move doors. And it can become a huge issue very quickly.
Okay, big job. Okay. Can you remind the listeners again about where they can go to get involved?
Yeah, so getting involved in the code system, that's the Canadian Board for Harmonized Construction Code website.
Okay.
And it's right there on the drop-down list on how to getting involved and submitting a code change.
Okay, awesome. Are there any other little tidbits you want to throw out there before we wrap her up?
Please, if you are ever inclined, you can just public observer is the easiest way to get started in that.
Okay.
You can just pop in. It's got a list of the meetings, the dates, and a Zoom link or a Teams link to jump on.
Okay.
And you can just jump on and just sit back and watch and listen and take it all in.
Okay. Very cool. Awesome. Thanks a lot, Trevor. That was super fascinating. That's a little more fascinating than I thought it might be, to be honest. And I think the listeners are going to think the exact same thing.
Oh, yeah. Well, I think it's very fascinating, but it's my job, and I'm a code administration nerd is the way I describe myself. So I'm like, there's nothing more interesting than this.
This is this is S level.
Yeah, I am extremely biased.
Yeah.
But yeah, I do love my job.
Cool. Well, I think that's the kind of person we would want in this position, someone who loves their job and is not necessarily, just doing it to do it. So I think that's great news.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, cool. Well, thanks for coming on the show, Trevor, and we'll do this again sometime once the codes get updated.
Awesome.
All right, cool. See ya.